IPA, and not the fun kind that most of you are probably not allowed to drink. But the even more fun International Phonetic Alphabet. So IPA is super useful for singers because you can mark your music even if you with ideas for how to pronounce something or reminders for how to pronounce something, even if you don't speak the language that you're singing in. And no matter how many languages you speak, eventually you will come across one you don't speak while you're singing. So I'm going to teach you kind of a functional IPA that that we can cover in an hour, enough stuff that you know what to do when a diction coach or your teacher gives you specific instruction and you're trying to think like, how do I write that EH or EY or what do I do? So there are symbols for that and we will learn them. One of the advantages of IPA is that it works across languages. So once you learn this set of symbols, you can apply it to pretty much all the singing that you will do. But it is an additional set of symbols that you have to learn in order to do that. I think there are two other advantages to IPA that people don't talk about as much, which I have come across when I start working with students, and they are that it brings awareness to yourself for how the voice works, and how vowels works, how these sounds are created in the first place, when you start thinking about how to transcribe them. So it actually is very useful from a technical standpoint to just become aware that, for example, when we say A, we think of that as a single vowel, because we write it as a single vowel, but if you actually take a moment to feel what's going on in your mouth and transcribe it, you realize that it's actually two vowel sounds, A, E, and specifically what those vowel sounds are. And then the other kind of advantage that's less talked about, I think, is it can give you some insight onto how to physically produce certain sounds. Like in the diction class, we spent about one session getting quite technical and using terms like pre-palatal and alveolar and glottal and velar and this kind of stuff, and they're all different points of articulation. And it's useful to become aware of the fact that the way you're pronouncing certain consonants actually depends on where your tongue is hitting inside your mouth or on your teeth, or which that your teeth are touching your lip or things like that, because there are certain sounds that all of us struggle to make, and becoming aware of physically what exactly it is that helps us make those sounds is very useful too. So those are kind of the main reasons why as singers we study IPA and should learn some basic IPA. Let me give you also some reasons why not. Because actually it might surprise you to know that I went many, many, many years without ever taking a diction class, without ever learning any IPA, even already having my master's degree. I tested out of the stuff I needed to test out of, because there is an alternative to learning IPA, and that is to learn to read in the languages that you're going to be asked to sing in. Now, obviously, I had an unfair advantage because I grew up speaking 2 of the 3, and then just took a course in the other one. But that is something to be aware of, not just being facetious, not just joking. It is something to be aware of. There are lots of subtle differences between languages that IPA doesn't do a good job of capturing. Or, I should say that you can capture them with some of the more arcane symbols in IPA, diacritical marks and so on, but at that point you're expending so much effort that you may as well just learn to read in that language. So there are some subtle differences, and you do need to put in a little bit of additional effort to pronounce the difference between French and Italian and German, even when the symbol looks the same on the page. So that's one big, big, big limitation. And then, just in general, you do, for the languages, if you go on and do this professionally, and there are certain languages that become central to your repertoire, you really do want to learn to just speak that language, read that language, and so on. Because there are all sorts of other things, other reasons to do that. But for your student years, and if you don't go on to do this professionally, I think it's very useful to do IPA. So, that brings us to which IPA specifically should we learn? Because you do kind of hit a point of diminishing returns once you get to a certain level of complexity. And what I'm going to introduce to you today is pretty much what I think everybody should know, and there isn't too much in addition to that that you probably need to know, unless there's a specific reason you need to learn it. We're going to focus mostly on vowel symbols, because we mostly spend most of our time singing on vowels. There are a couple consonants I want to bring to your attention as we go, but mostly we're going to spend time on vowel symbols, and then a couple of the more confusing consonants. Now, before we talk about vowels, I want to introduce to you a general analogy for thinking about vowels that will help you a lot, I think. And that is, have you ever, when you're like, you doing a color on the computer, like filling in a color thing or doing a color background or something, you see that color wheel that they have on the computer? And if you can think of vowels as kind of existing like on that color wheel, where there's definitely a color that you would call red, and there's definitely a color that you would call blue. But you can fade from red to blue and blue to red, and at some point in the middle, you would clearly call the color purple. But, you know, there's the purplish red, and the reddish purple, and the bluish purple, and all these other in between. You know, Crayola does a really good job of coming up with names for them, but all these other things in between exist. It's actually a continuous thing. And the same thing is really true for vowels as well. You've got your E, and you've got your A, and you've got A somewhere in the middle. But where exactly you stop calling it E and start calling it A, and stop calling it A and start calling it A, and whatever, that is a continuous thing, and it depends on the language that you're in, and it depends on all sorts of other things. So this color wheel analogy is a useful way to think about it, because it helps put all the IPA in context. I'm going to give you a set of symbols, and if you recognize that they're all kind of on a color line, and some languages tend to cheat more in this direction or more in that direction, it gives you a good foundation. So let's dive right in and start with the basic vowels. So the pure, basic, we'll call them maybe the Latin vowels, the Italian vowels. The Latin vowels are A, E, O, and U. Now, those are just the vowels. We say A, E, I, O, U in English, but in any Romance language you would say A, E, O, U. Each of these has infinite shades, but these are the basic ones that you want to use as a starting point. Now, let's first talk about varieties of A. You can have, and English actually has a wealth of varieties of A, more than a lot of other languages. You can say father, you can say Chicago, you can say awe, like if you're like fawning. You can also, with regional accents, you might get accents, you might get like all, you might get at, almost. So there are lots and lots and lots of different A's. The two main ones that I find it useful to write are the dark A, which in IPA is just the lowercase a, or you might maybe write it more clearly like this, so that you become aware that what you're saying is dark A. And the bright A, which in IPA is written like a typewriter, like letter A, lowercase a. The reason those are really the only two I talk about too much is because in singing, generally we want to make a round, warm, rich sound. And if you start going too far towards ah, you lose that. And if you start going too far towards all, you introduce tongue tension. And so in the end, all of the vowels end up approximating to one of these two. And I would argue, in fact, in opera, most of them are just going to go to the darker one anyway, even when they're bright. So even if I say Chicago, I'm not going to sing Chicago unless I'm really making a big deal of how bright to make that sound. I'm going to sing Chicago and make it more pop. So think of them as basically dark A and basically light A. And the two symbols are, this one's not super clear. The two symbols are that, dark and bright. The other kind of one that's relatively easy to talk about is oo. English has a very particular oo sound. It's a little more in the lips, it's a little more ooh, ooh, ooh. There can be some jaw tension in it. The farther west you go, the worse that seems to get, until you get all the way to pure surfer do, that kind of sound. Obviously, we don't sing in that very much either, again, unless you're specifically doing maybe a musical theater song where you are supposed to be a surfer dude. But in general, when we sing, we're going to make it a much rounder, pure ooh sound, and that's going to ring well when we sing. And I wouldn't, for now, introduce any additional symbols for that. So we're just going to use a lowercase u for what we call the closed oo. We'll talk about open Okay, before we go on to these in-between ones, E. E is one of the vowels that is most universal among all languages. In fact, I think I remember reading somewhere, but I can't quote where, that E is the only sound that exists in every single language that this particular person studied. So E is the most universal sound. And your E in English is your E in Italian, is your E in German, is your E in Russian. So you don't need to worry about that one too much. But know that the symbol for that pure E, which we might actually spell as E, like that, right? Or, depending on the word, you might spell it as E or whatever. The symbol for that sound in IPA is the lowercase I, so we're using the Italian spelling. Now, English is a little bit of a tricky language when it comes to vowels, because we do something called diphthong. And I'm guessing most of you have probably come across this word. Diphthong means that when you have two vowel sounds on a single syllable. And specifically in English, there are two vowels that we almost always turn into diphthongs. And they are the A sound, which is usually spelled with the letter A. You may have learned it phonetically as the long A with a line over it. And what are the two sounds that make up that single vowel? That make up that diphthong? Yeah, kind of. A and E. And which A and which E, maybe we'll get into in a second, but yeah, it's some version of A and some version of E. And then the other one that we always diphthong in English is O. And what are the two vowel sounds in O? O and U. So it's some kind of a letter O and some kind of a letter U. O. So you almost immediately run into this problem. Beginning singers, American-speaking or native English-speaking singers, as soon as they start singing in Italian, they're constantly saying A every time they're supposed to be saying A, and they're constantly saying O every time they're supposed to be saying O. And this is something I'm sure many of you have worked on or struggled with. But it's really useful to become aware of that. In fact, I would recommend that if this is not immediately obvious to you, that you spend some time by yourself going A, and really feel that you're saying E, and become really aware of it so that then you can choose not to do it when you're not supposed to. Okay, so let's go on with the letter E and the letter O now. I wanted to bring up the diphthong issue first. There are basically two versions of the letter of the A sound that we want to become aware of as singers. One is what I call the open E, what everybody calls the open E, and the other one is the closed E. So the open E is spelled in IPA with this epsilon symbol. An open E is not too hard for us English speakers because we use it in our language. It's spelled any number of ways, but it's the main vowel in words like met, get, head, bet, and if you were just going to write it down, you might write it down as EH, right? That's your open E. It's pretty standard. Some people open it more, some people don't open it as much, but all of us have some version of that. The closed letter E, the closed E, is spelled with a capital E. And this one's a little trickier for us English speakers. And actually, it's one of the ones that varies a lot between the singing languages as well. But in its most extreme form, it's like the German A sound. It's so close that unless you really pay attention, you might mistake it for an E. A, they're very close. So on the color wheel, if we've got open E over here and E over here, A is closer to E than it is to E. And certainly if you're going all the way from E to A, and E is somewhere in the middle, A is quite close to E. But that's the German version. That's if you're singing ewig. If you're doing the French version, it's not quite as much. C'est vrai. Entendez. And if you're doing the Italian version, the closed A and the open A are so similar that depending on the regional accent, you might not even hear the difference at all. But in any case, I think it is useful to have a feeling of a more open aware of that. And second, we're going to practice making all these sounds. Similar to the letter E, we've got the letter O, which has a more open version, which in IPA is spelled as a backwards C. But don't think of it as a backwards C. Think of it as an O that has an opening. It's an open O. The reason the opening is on the left is because if you put it on the right, it looks like a C. If you put it on the top, it looks like a U, right? So they had to put it there so that it doesn't look like anything else. And the closed O. Now the closed O actually feels more comfortable, I think, for most English speakers, because it is the beginning sound of our O diphthong. So if you say the word go, you're saying O. And if you say the word go and you make yourself not go to oo, you say go and you stop, that's basically a closed O. This one also exists in more extreme versions and less extreme versions. In German, in the word tot, it's going to be way more closed than in Italian, and when you say vero, vero. And depending on your regional accent, again, you might say vero. And it's basically open. The open O doesn't really exist in English. Everybody kind of has various versions of what English word most closely approximates it, but most of them are either too much like ah or too closed. I haven't really found one where I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds exactly like an Italian O. So if somebody has one that they think works, I'm all ears. I haven't found one that I like. But it basically, think a very open sound, almost ah, but round your lips enough that it sounds like an O. So everybody say ah, O. O. That's your open O, basically. And this happens in Italian in words like notte, and it happens in German in words like Gott. It's the same O sound. Now, I gave you the pure oo. The pure oo is the closed oo. But I'm right now speaking as an English speaker and said the closed oo really is the closed oo. Ooh, really make it deep. The open version of that exists in English and is pretty comfortable for us, but I do find that people don't really think of it easily. A lot of the time, even though you make this sound all the time, you recognize it no problem, if I mispronounce it, you aren't always aware that that's the sound you're making. If you say the word foot or good, that's an O sound in the middle of that vowel. You're definitely not saying foot or goo, right? It's not closed. And you're not saying fot or got. Those are our options, right? And you're not saying fot or go, but people get confused, and it really is O. It's a sound that we all make. We just don't think that we make it. It is often spelled as a double O. But then again, so is the closed U in words like food. So let's try making all these. Oh, and sorry, and then the E. So the pure E that every language has is the lowercase e. But the open version of that, again, very common in English, it. It like hit or bit or in. In fact, it's so common in English that we often mispronounce words that should be E in foreign languages with an it. Like people often mispronounce in Latin. In excelsis. They say in excelsis. So these are our basic open and closed vowels. Technically, dark A and bright A are both, dark A and bright A are both technically open vowels, so it's not exactly following the pattern, but it does functionally follow the pattern of a darker and a brighter. Actually, I probably should have switched these two because grammatically, like in German, they actually behave opposite. But in any case, at least we have this. In fact, let me just do that, so that if you're taking notes or you're watching the video afterwards, it actually is more correct to do it that way. Okay, so let's try making all these sounds. Everybody say ah. 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 So you might spell this A-H. Ah. Say ah. Now you might spell this A-W. You just have to be really careful that you don't tense the root of your tongue when you sing. That you don't go all, and get, I'm exaggerating, but that you don't put that whole thing like that. Ah. That it remains ah. Okay, so ah. Good. This is e. Good. And the German e. Good. This is I. O. And a German O. Good. Open O. And U. Good. So far so good. Any questions on any of those? And I should check the time. I'm sure we're on pace. Good. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the concept of a schwa. Anybody know what schwa is? I guess some of you do. Yes, Justin.
It's like,
yes, exactly. Yeah, no, go ahead, say what you're going to say.
Yeah, like your mouth is totally relaxed.
Yeah, and in fact, we tend to just kind of use a schwa when we're stalling for time in talking before answering, right? So you say, there's your schwa. The symbol for a schwa is an upside down E. And what's funny about it is different languages use the same schwa process for stalling in conversation, and they do it a little bit different. So a French person, instead of going like Justin did, might go and purse their lips a little bit more. And a German person might put a little bit more in it. And an Italian wouldn't do it, because Italians don't have schwa. So they might say or something like that, and they wouldn't actually go so it's really fascinating. The schwa is kind of your most relaxed, I'm not thinking about making any sound kind of vowel. It's called medial. Medial is when your tongue kind of relaxes to the middle of your mouth. And you can think of medialization as something, it's like going to the middle of the color wheel. Okay, so you still have the color wheel, but you can have like a more intense yellow or a less intense yellow, a more intense red or a less intense red. So the tongue can go to a position of less intense. Which I sometimes call schwaification, but I think the correct term is medialization. So I think we do kind of want to get used to some of the different schwas. This is the pure schwa, and the pure schwa does have a little bit of ed to it. I think that's why they chose an upside down letter E. But in French, you're still going to transcribe it in an IPA as this upside down E, but you're going to add a little bit of lip rounding to it. You're going to purse it a little bit. You're going to think of a French person who's just a little bit more, and you're going to go as opposed to okay, so it's not going to be quite as neutral. If the English schwa, well, the English schwa doesn't really go to anything, but if the German schwa goes towards e, we'll talk about that in a second. The French schwa kind of goes to a mixed vowel, which we also haven't talked about yet. It kind of goes more towards and we'll talk about mixed vowels in a second. In German, I actually usually have students transcribe two varieties of the schwa, if you're going to transcribe them into IPA. One is still the upside down letter E. The other is the upside down letter A, like that. And the reason I have students do that is because there are two different situations that schwas come up in German. When you have a final E versus when you have a final ER, that make a big difference in terms of meaning. You also get this schwa in other spellings like EN and EM and so on. It's pretty much always spelled with the letter E in German. But anyway, the point is that in many German words, if you end it with the letter E, schwa, it is a feminine gender, and if you end it with the letter ER, schwa, it's the masculine. And they are pronounced differently. I think probably because you want to be able to differentiate which one you're saying. So if you say the word beloved in German, it's Geliebte, Geliebte, and at the end I say Geliebte. But if I say beloved like a male beloved, I would say geliebter. And it's a little more, it's still a schwa, but it's more got an color to it. So geliebte, geliebter. And so I actually do make a distinction between these two. Some people don't worry so much about that and make the difference through an R. So you might see this symbol instead, which is literally a schwa with an R attached to it, like a cursive R attached to it. And yes, your computer does make this symbol. If you go into insert symbol and look through the IPA list, it's there. So this might be something that you can bring up between you and your teacher, or you can just kind of decide for yourself. It really is, it's a stylistic difference. Some people tend to pronounce those R's more when they sing in German. It's the more refined, more classical, more sophisticated pronunciation of German tends to use more of those final R's. So instead of saying der, you might say der, and just put a little flip at the end. And if you do that, then you're just gonna, well, der, actually, it doesn't have the schwa, but you might say geliebte, geliebte. And if you put the R on, you don't need to go towards the R schwa quite so much. So it's like I said, it's a question of taste. So maybe ask your teacher, but at least add these symbols to your repertoire. Know that some schwas are more on, some schwas are more e. And if you consistently get the note from a coach or from a teacher that it sounds too much like you're saying e every time you have a schwa, maybe start using this symbol just to remind yourself and make it a little more on. At the end of the session today, if we have time, I'm going to actually go over some practical examples of how to write these things into your music and why we're learning them. But for now, those are your symbols. Okay, so I covered schwas and utilization. We'll just double check it. Good. So the next thing I want to talk about now is mixed vowels. I think we still have room to just add into this list here. Mixed vowels. So before I talk about mixed vowels, let's talk for a second about how these sounds are physically produced in your mouth. So a vowel is produced how? If you're singing the same note, you're not changing pitches, and you're singing the same vowel, and everything else stays the same, and you go from A to E, what are you changing? Your tongue. Yeah. But lips is not a bad answer, because that's the correct answer for my next question. What's the difference when then you instead go from A to U? And there the primary component is the lips. So there are two things that determine the articulation of the vowel. And like with anything else vocal, that's the simple answer, and then there's a more complicated answer that there are actually a lot of other things as well, including the vocal folds themselves. But on the surface, there are two things that determine the vowel. The lips and the tongue. And in fact, some people call those vowels which require tongue motion to be pronounced the tongue vowels. I usually refer to them as the front vowels because that's how they feel. And what are the front vowels? The ones that require the tongue? Do you know? Somebody? Try to figure it out. Make a sound and move your tongue around and see what happens. A and E. I heard it both. Yes, good. So usually we talk about front vowels or tongue vowels as being the varieties of A and E. And which ones do you need your lips for? What are the lip vowels? O and U. And those are usually also called back vowels. You can call them lip vowels or back vowels. And A is kind of in the middle. You don't need your lips for it, and your tongue is low. So for A and E, actually your tongue rises up. For E, it goes as high as it can go. I think that's why it's in every language, because that's as far as it goes. If you go any farther than that, you're not letting air out of your mouth anymore. So I put these in the order that we spell the vowels, which also is alphabetical order. But really, a more intelligent order would be E, E, A, O, U. And the reason that's a more intelligent order is because here your tongue is the highest, then it goes lower, then it's low, then it actually does flatten out a little bit, but your lips start to round while the tongue remains low, and then while the tongue remains low, your lips round even farther. And in the well-produced singing tone, the jaw is not required. The jaw remains loose and free. In speaking, that's not true. In speaking, we do use the jaw to pronounce the vowels. But in singing, we don't, which means that visually in the face and in the jaw, there doesn't need to be any difference between E, A, and I. I can go I, E, and if you can see inside my mouth, you see movement, but if you just look at the outside of my face, you don't see movement, right? And the vowels still sound clear, so I'm just using my tongue to pronounce it. Now that is a little bit easier said than done, what I just did, especially if you open your mouth a lot. It becomes quite difficult to pronounce E without closing your jaw a little bit. But in principle, the jaw is not involved in those vowels, and therefore, your face is not involved. That is not true for O and U. However, the bit about the jaw is still true. The jaw remains not involved if you pronounce them well. And you can go E, A, by putting my finger here, my molars are separated, so my jaw can't close without biting my own cheek. And yet I can still pronounce that vowel. And then the same is true then even farther. Yeah? Now, without training, it's much more likely to be and you overdo the lips, you close the jaw, and some of those other things are not true. But you can refine the vowels to the point where the jaw isn't moving at all. Why did I bring this up? Well, because when we build the mixed vowels, what we do is we actually take a component of a back vowel and a component of a front vowel. So the main mixed vowels that you're going to come across are in French and in German. In German, they're the ones that are spelled with umlaut, U with 2 dots and O with 2 dots. In French, the U with 2 dots sound is actually just spelled with the letter U. And the O with 2 dots sound is spelled with usually an EU. Sometimes there's an O in there too. So the IPA, however, for these is, well, let's make the sound first, and then I'll show you why the IPA is actually really easy to remember. So, the first sound, the mixed U, this one, is U. Everybody say that? U. Now, what do you say? What are you doing to make that sound? So you can look at my face. U. U. What does it look like in my face? Looks like an U, right? U. 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 So, my lips are rounded like a U. But I'm not saying ooh, I'm saying U. What is making this that shift? I heard somebody say it. The tongue. So I'm lifting my tongue as though I were saying what? E. And I'm rounding my lips as though I were saying ooh. And when I do both of those together, I get U. So this sound is E plus U. And the IPA for it is a lowercase y. And just like we had the closed version and the open version of all these other vowels, we have the closed version and the open version of this. So U is an E plus an U, and Ö is an I plus an O. So that's called medialization also. The tongue kind of went towards the center a little bit more. So everybody say I. I. What sound is that? Capital I. I. Open I. And everybody say O.
O.
O. Not O. O.
O.
Like foot. O. And now put your lips into an O. And say it, and you get and that is your capital Y. So those are your two IPA sounds for those mixed vowels. In French, you're only going to get the lowercase one, the U. In German, you get both. And just like we had E plus U, anybody want to guess what we're going to mix to get O, to get the sound? There's not much left. We're going to mix E plus O. So everybody say A, and hold your A and start rounding your lips. A. You get has the IPA symbol O/. And in the same way, here I should complete this. Oh, by the way, the reason we write this weird horseshoe, capital O, capital U, is simply because, at least in my opinion, it's simply because the lowercase u looks exactly like the capital U. And so if you wrote it in that way, you wouldn't know if you were writing it bigger or smaller, right? So you had to come up with something that looks slightly different. So they use that kind of horseshoe looking letter U. Okay, and just like we did with the E and the U, we can do an open and round your lips as though you were saying O. And that is your OE, which I've always thought should be spelled like this. But that's kind of an insane symbol and nobody uses it. So it's the OE. Now already, I hope you can imagine, once you've learned these basic principles, if somebody assigns you a song in French and starts correcting your pronunciation of some of these vowels, you can see the power of this approach. Because if you're not 100% sure what sound to make, you put that symbol in your music, and then you can go either review this lecture, for example, and remember how to make the sound, or you could go on Wikipedia and they have sound samples of all the different IPA vowels, or you can ask a teacher or whatever, right? But the key is learning to make this simple, and then you can make it in German, and you can do it in French, and whenever it comes up, you solve it. If you happen to be singing in Swedish and you have absolutely no idea how to pronounce Swedish, and the Swedish coach is like, oh yeah, that's just the open mixed just like in German, then you know, oh, okay, cool, I'll just write that. Yeah? All right. I think those are the mixed vowels. Just in case you were wondering, in German you come across this one a lot too, but that's just an open A. Okay, so the A with 2 dots is not a mixed vowel. Okay, then there. Yes, Skylar, of course. It's like overload, right? It's too many sounds. We're actually going to practice them all in a second, but yes, I'd be happy to. Which ones do you want to get?
Oh, just the mixed.
The mixed ones? Sure. So, U, Ö, Ö, Ö. So, U versus Ö, U, Ö. I know it's a little, like, if you're not used to it, it's a little hard. And Ö, Ö. Those, I think, are probably the hardest to distinguish. Distinguish the difference between Ö, Ö, O, O, and E can really get difficult. Yes?
Were you doing the difference between the O with a slash and a capital Y?
Oh, yeah, good question. Ö, Ö. Ö, Ö. So part of it is also, the closed versions tend to be lengthened in language, and the open versions tend to be short. So like, if you say the word hit, it's short, it's quick, it's open, hit. And you say heat, it's a little bit lengthened, it's a little bit stretched. So part of this is also context, when you're going versus now of course, when we actually start singing, the length is the length of the note, so all of a sudden that difference starts to disappear, and that's where a lot of people run into trouble, actually. But yeah, that's an excellent question. Yes, Sarah?
So the U with the dots makes both of those sounds?
Yes, and we'll learn more about that in German dictionary. So stay tuned, but yes, it'll make both. It follows exactly the same rules for when a sound is open versus closed for all the other vowels in German. So if you don't know those rules, you'll learn them. If you do, just apply the same ones. Okay? Yes. Was there one other question next to you? No? No? Okay. Anybody else? Keep them coming. They're good. They're excellent questions. All right. So there are 2 more categories of vowel sounds that I want to make sure we hit. The next category, I'm trying to keep them all up here so that then we can practice making the sounds. The next category is nasals. where my mouth is literally closed, or where my mouth can be open and closed, or okay? What they all have in common is, it's a nice meditation. What they all have in common is air is coming out your nose. You can't stay in the M while plugging your nose. That's why you sound silly when you have a cold, because the M's and the N's and the N's don't come out right. But you can also redirect air out your nose while pronouncing a vowel. And lest you think this is a weird foreign concept, we do it in English. We do it every time we have an ah sound followed by an N or an NG. In the word song. We don't go song unless we're singing and really concentrating. We go song, song, and the sound comes out the nose. The sound. And sometimes the song comes out the nose. Okay, so we actually do it, but again, like many other things, we're not aware of it until somebody brings it to our attention and we start studying IPA, which is actually one of the powerful things about studying IPA. In French, you do it much more methodically, and there are all sorts of rules for when you do and when you don't, which are beyond the time we have available. However, let's just learn the symbols, and it's really actually quite clever, quite straightforward. What you do in IPA is you get the core vowel sound, and then you add a nasalization on top of it. So the ones that you're going to come across are dark ah with the nasal, closed o with the nasal, open eh with the nasal. The nasal is just the tilde symbol on the far left, top left of your keyboard, and the OE with the nasal, nasalization. So everybody say a normal ah, and then kind of make it nasal. That's the sound that we use for song. Yes, and it's the one that you, if you're going to say like an en in French, it's the one you're going to do like enfant. It's also for an, en and an in French. We'll do that. Now let's make it close o and make it quite close, like a German o. O. Now make that one nasal. Oh. That's your French O-N nasal. And almost everybody that I've ever worked with makes that one too open. Okay, so you don't say songer, it's songer. Okay? Or ils sont, like really quite close. Then there's the wide open one. This one's kind of fun. You say and then make it nasal. I may have did a little much, but and that's going to be your IN. IN like cinq, the number 5, cinq. Which almost sounds like an a to us, right? Like a cat. And by the way, if you're curious, people don't usually sing this vowel, so we don't usually bother, but the a, the English a, is an A next to an E, a. Okay, so anyway, we've got and then we've got, remember what this sound is? It's the open, This is the, actually, confusingly, it's the UN sound, which the first time somebody tried to teach me how to make that sound, they said, just pretend somebody punched you in the stomach. And it's kind of that. So it's kind of Okay? So that's not super precise, but it kind of gives you an idea. You make the core sound, you make it nasal, and those are your French nasals. And the ones that I really make a point of learning, the main one I really make a point of learning the symbol for is a closed O nasal, because this is the one that everybody misses. We tend to make this sound for all of them. And why do you think that is? It's the only one we have in English. So it's funny because none of you, I would guess, none or maybe one or two of you at most, were aware that you're making a nasal sound in English when you say song. And yet somehow that fact creeps into all of your French pronunciation until somebody corrects it. Isn't that interesting? It's because the way languages work, once you've made a symbol, a sound, thousands and thousands and thousands of times talking, that's the sound that naturally comes out. And a lot of learning diction is like learning how to make the other sound and like really sticking to your guns and making sure that you're pronouncing that other sound. Okay, and then the final category of vowel or vowel-like sound is the glides. What's a glide? Specifically an on glide. We talk about glides, we're talking about on glide. Nobody? It's like the opposite of a diphthong. What's a diphthong? Remember? Diphthong is when you have how many vowels? 2. But the extra vowel is at the end. O, A, right? Sometimes called an off glide. But an on glide, the extra little bit, the moving vowel is at the beginning instead of at the end. And we use these quite a bit in English. For example, everybody say water.
Water.
Okay, now stop on the as though you were singing the word water on hold up. Wa. Okay. Did you notice you did something before you got to the I mean, we spell it with a W, right? Wa. Is that a vowel? Did you learn A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y and W, right? Some people don't learn the W bit. Some people do. But if you heard the sometimes Y, W doesn't look like a vowel, but it behaves like a vowel sort of. It behaves like it because it's a glide. It's really, if you were writing that in Italian, you might write it with the letter U. Wa, wa. You sound like you have an Italian accent when you do it that way, but it's very close. Wa, 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 right? As opposed to wa. There's a very slight difference. And so we call that the W glide. Conveniently, you don't have to learn a different symbol for that. There's another glide. What's the similar glide? You start, instead of starting with remember, they actually correspond to our English diphthongs. The U at the end of the O. What's the other one we had? We had the E at the end of the E. So what happens if you put the E at the beginning instead? Yeah, right? Instead of A, you go yeah. So it sounds kind of like an E. It's not quite an E. How might you spell it? You might spell it with a Y. Y's already taken, sorry. So how else might you spell it? You're right though, you pretty much always spell it with a Y in English. Like yet or yellow, yeah, J, exactly. Because a lot of languages use that sound, spell it with a J. So that's what they did for IPA. IPA was just a bunch of people that came together and decided which symbols to use, right? The meat of the knowledge is in the sounds. And then somebody picks some symbols. And the symbols are kind of a majority consensus of most languages. Like most languages use some version of this for an E sound and some version of this for an A sound. We're weird, so that we go A and and E. In any case, it's the J glide and the W glide. So we've got wa and ye or ya, u. So Y-O-U, the word U is a J glide followed by a what? A closed U. U, right? And there's actually one more glide, and it's the Y glide. Which makes you say, why? But because Y is already taken, we write it as a weird Y that doesn't have a hook. Kind of looks like an upside down H, but has nothing to do with H. And it's basically, you take the mixed. So we already have an E sound that's turned into a glide and an U sound that's turned into a glide. Now we take the U sound and turn that into a glide. So in French, this comes up nuit. You don't say nuit and you don't say ni. You say nuit. You start from a mixed vowel class. Nuit. We are in the night to say nuit. Okay, so those are our vowels. We'll just type it out. 9 minutes, great. All right, let's do a quick pass through all of them. Ready? Right? Start. And in German? In German? Good. I love that for the German ones, everybody drops like another perfect fifth lower. They're like, Then our schwa. Good. Our French schwa. go quite far on the E direction. In fact, in German, it's often rhymed with an E. It's never rhymed with an U. Ü, and open. Ü. Good. And then the O schwa, or the O mix. Ü. And open. Ü. Not quite as confident, but okay, we're getting there. Let's run through the nasals real quick. And then finally, let's do all the glides followed. Well, let's do this one followed by an O. Ready? Whoa. Let's do this one followed by a U. Yeah, a U. U. And let's do this one followed by E. 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 The reason we do that is that's what happens. Okay. Excellent. So, there are lots of ways, before, I want to hit very, very briefly some consonants, but before we do that, I want to give you the most useful ways to use these in your own, marking your own score. The first is for technical reasons. Those of you who study with me know that I like you to start closing down your vowels through the passaggio, right? So, if you're going along and you're saying, and I'm like, that needs to be more closed, you might just write a closed O in there, even though technically it's an open O when you transcribe your Italian. It's a technical note to yourself to close that note. Conversely, you might be saying a really low note, you're not getting enough sound, you're going, your teacher says, just open up the vowel a little bit. Write in an open ed, why not? Right? Even if it's not the correct IPA, it's the correct technical instruction. So that's one really, really useful way to do these. Another is just literally, I don't read German, I need to pronounce this song. I have learned that this is Ü, I'm just going to put that symbol in. And I know the difference between Ü and Ö. And in the score, they're all U with 2 dots. So in my IPA, I'm going to write those in there so that I know which one to do. That's the other very useful way to use these. Besides that, also the A's. A lot of the time you'll get notes on that a particular A was too dark or too bright. So just use the other one to give yourself a note. Okay, let's briefly talk about consonants. I want you to just make you aware of 3 different ways that consonants happen. The first is that you make a consonant, so the consonant is always created by some turbulence somewhere in your mouth, and it's usually because you're constricting one articulator against another. Most commonly, it's the tongue against some part of the roof of your mouth, either farther forward or farther back. Or it can be the teeth on your lips, or some combination of lips too. In any case, that turbulence, that kind of disruption of the airflow, can either be sustained or it could be in just a quick instant. When it's sustained, it's called a fricative. Everybody say that? Fricative. So, for example, the first letter in the word fricative, hold it out. Okay, that's a consonant, it's an F, you can hold it out, that is a fricative. Okay? When you can't hold it out, when you physically, as much as you try, can't hold it out, it's called a plosive. Everybody say plosive. And the first letter in the word plosive is, and as much as you try, you can't go hold it, right? So that's a plosive. And then there's another type of consonant articulation that is technically 2 different consonant sounds, one stuck next to the other. It's always a plosive followed by a fricative. So if you try to hold that consonant, what you're holding is the fricative. But when you pronounce it, you put the plosive at the beginning. Would be a good one. That happens in German, actually. But I was thinking more like ch. So an SH is a fricative. Right? And a T is a plosive. When you put a T at the beginning of an SH, you get and if you just say it like that, it sounds like a CH. If you hold it, you realize you're holding a right? Interesting. And actually the same thing is true when you add voice. So a voiced consonant is literally the same consonant that you were just making, but you add vocal fold vibration, you add voice to it. You can sing it on a pitch. So when you were going sh, instead you go sh. It's exactly the same articulation, but you add voice. So everybody say sh, 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 sh. That's called a voiced unvoiced pair. You can do s and z. That's actually a really important one to know because it's, first of all, it's a mistake people make all the time. But second, in certain languages, you might not know which one to put in because they're both spelled with an S. So just write in either an S or a Z. I don't need to teach you the idea for that because it's just S for Z. Thank God. And the same thing is true of the cluster. I don't think I said what the cluster is called. When you have a plosive followed by a fricative, it's called an affricate. And you can have a voiced affricate as well. So instead of saying ch, we say j, 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 which sounds really weird until you realize it's just the letter J, like in the word jet, right? It's a d, a voiced T is d, d, t, d, 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 followed by j, which is a voiced sh. So instead of going T to SH, you go D to j, which might be spelled as a ZH. It does have an IPA symbol, but whatever. And then two other points I want to make on consonants, and then we're done. The first is the same principle I said that applies for vowels, where one language is slightly different, there are subtleties, there are subtle differences. There's a not so subtle difference between English and German and that variety of consonants, and Italian and French and that variety of consonants, and that is that we love to waste air on consonants, and Romance language speakers don't. So we say t, and all that air is wasted, and Italians say t, 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 and don't waste any air. It's the same consonant. We pronounce it essentially the same way. If you want to get really nitpicky, the tongue hits in a slightly different place, but it's basically the same consonant. So, but we don't say, in Italian we don't say tutto. We say tutto, tutto, and there's almost no air at all. But in English we don't say try that. We say try that, right? So there's tons of air. So that's the first thing to be aware of. That Italian and French do not aspirate. That's called aspirating, adding air. Do not aspirate their consonants. English and German do. And then the second point I want to make is that there are, and this is the one consonant symbol pair I want you to learn, the IPA for, is the Ich-Laut in German versus the Ach-Laut. They are two different sounds. This one, it has an IPA of a C with a little tail on it, and it's pronounced the tongue is quite forward. It's hitting on the front of your hard palate. Actually, the air is hitting there. The tongue is making a shape such that the air hits your hard palate. And that's spelled like that. And the other one is way back. The tongue is making a shape so that the air is gurgling around on your soft palate on your V-line. And they are very different. The IPA for that sound is an X. And a huge pet peeve of mine, granted I'm a native German speaker, is when people just go in the roof of their mouth for both. It's not ich and tu, tu. It's ich and tu. Forward, back. And so because that difference is so noticeable to the German ear and so unnoticeable to somebody who doesn't speak German, I recommend you learn those symbols so that you can constantly remind yourself, because you will be, I guarantee, constantly corrected on them. Okay? So that's it in a snapshot. I do have one book that I can recommend if you want to just have a handy reference. I didn't bring it with me, but it's called the IPA Guidebook. It costs $12. It's by Sherry Montgomery. And you can find it, I think it's SME Published or something like that. I don't want to quote the wrong thing, so just search for that. And I'm sure you'll find it. You can get it directly from her website. All right, thanks everyone. Good work.
It's like, I'm sure you